My name is Allison Parker, and on what should have been the most exciting planning stage of my life, I found myself staring at an empty savings account while across town, my younger brother Ethan and his wife were hanging a "Home Sweet Home" sign on their new 4-bedroom Tudor-style house, purchased with the money that had been promised for my wedding since I was 15. 2 years later, as I accepted a prestigious industry award that established my own financial independence, I received a letter that would unravel the truth behind what really happened to my wedding fund and force my family to confront the painful reality of their choices. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I always believed hard work was the foundation of success. That's what my parents taught me growing up in our modest home in Portland, where the persistent rain seemed to mirror my father's constant reminder that life rewards those who prepare for storms. By 32, I had built a career that embodied this philosophy. With my degree from Oregon State University and my MBA from Seattle Pacific, I had worked my way up to become marketing director at Westridge Creative Solutions, overseeing campaigns for clients across the Pacific Northwest from our downtown Portland office, with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed Mount Hood on clear days. The view from that office represented everything I had methodically worked toward: professional respect, financial stability, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had achieved it through my own merit. My personal life seemed to be following the same carefully orchestrated path. After 4 years of dating, my boyfriend Daniel had proposed during a weekend hiking trip to Cannon Beach, presenting a vintage emerald ring that perfectly reflected my preference for understated elegance over conventional choices. We began planning a fall wedding at Bridal Veil Gardens, an intimate venue nestled in the Columbia River Gorge. Nothing extravagant, just 90 guests, locally sourced catering, and a string quartet Daniel had connections with through his work as a music teacher at Lincoln High School. The whole event would cost about $28,000, which seemed reasonable compared to the lavish ceremonies some of my college friends had thrown. "Don't worry about the venue deposit," my mother had assured me over Sunday brunch the week after our engagement. "Your father and I have been setting aside money for your wedding since you were in high school. It's all been earmarked specifically for this." The wedding fund had been mentioned throughout my adult life, a financial safety net created specifically for this milestone. When I received my first promotion and considered using the bonus to start my own savings, my father had discouraged it. "We've got your wedding covered," he'd said. "Put that money toward your retirement or a home down payment instead." I had followed his advice, maximizing my 401k contributions and building a separate investment portfolio, while many of my peers were spending on luxury apartments and weekend getaways. Daniel and I had been equally pragmatic, living in a modest 2-bedroom rental despite our combined income allowing for more, prioritizing financial security over immediate gratification. These choices reflected the values that had shaped my upbringing in the Parker household. My father, Richard, had built Parker Electrical from a small residential service company into a respectable commercial contractor with 20 employees. He approached both business and family with the same meticulous attention to detail and emphasis on planning. My mother, Catherine, had worked as an elementary school administrator before retiring to focus on community volunteering. Between them, they had created a home environment where achievement was expected, responsibility was paramount, and promises were treated as contracts. At least that's what I had always believed. My younger brother Ethan had taken a different approach to life. Where I was methodical, he was spontaneous. While I had followed a direct path through education into my career, Ethan had spent 3 years finding himself after high school, working at ski resorts and dabbling in photography, before eventually enrolling in community college. He had an undeniable creative talent, but seemed allergic to conventional planning. His charm and easygoing nature allowed him to land on his feet, despite his haphazard approach to life, which occasionally frustrated me but more often concerned our parents. When Ethan met Megan during his second attempt at college, our parents had been cautiously optimistic. She was studying nursing, practical and grounded in ways Ethan wasn't. When they moved in together after just 6 months, my parents had expressed concern about the rushed timeline. When Megan became pregnant a year later, those concerns deepened. "They're not ready for this responsibility," my mother confided during one of our weekly phone calls. "Your brother can barely remember to pay his cell phone bill on time." Despite these misgivings, when Ethan and Megan had a courthouse wedding just before their daughter Lily was born, my parents had thrown them a reception at their country club. "Family supports family," my father had declared in his toast, "no matter what unexpected paths we take." I had been genuinely happy for my brother. His road might have been winding, but he seemed to have found his footing. Megan was practical and loving, and baby Lily had brought out a sense of responsibility in Ethan I hadn't seen before. Their tiny 2-bedroom apartment was cramped, but filled with the chaotic energy of new parenthood and my brother's photography adorning the walls. The subtle shift in my parents' attention toward Ethan's new family happened so gradually, I barely noticed it. Sunday dinners increasingly revolved around Lily's latest milestones. Holiday planning centered on accommodating the baby's schedule. Conversations that once included questions about my work achievements now quickly pivoted to updates on my niece or Ethan's latest photography side gig. "He's really trying to be responsible now," my father would say, with an emphasis that suggested this was a significant and somewhat unexpected development. "The photography business is starting to bring in decent money." I understood the excitement of a first grandchild and was happy to see my brother maturing. What I didn't yet understand was how profoundly this shift would affect the promises that had been made to me. 8 months into our engagement, Daniel and I had finalized our wedding plans. We'd selected the venue, chosen a photographer, and designed the invitations. The next step was placing deposits to secure our date and vendors. That Sunday, I drove to my parents' house to discuss accessing the wedding fund they'd been contributing to for over 15 years. The ranch-style home where I'd grown up looked the same as always. Meticulously maintained lawn, hanging baskets of fuchsias on the porch, the brass knocker my father polished every spring. Inside, family photos chronicled our lives through the years, with recent additions prominently featuring Lily in various poses. My parents were in the kitchen, my mother arranging cookies on a plate while my father reviewed papers at the table. The scene was so familiar, it immediately put me at ease. Sunday afternoons had always been for family discussions, financial planning, and my mother's chocolate chip cookies served on the blue willow plates reserved for these occasions. "Perfect timing," my mother said, greeting me with a hug that smelled of vanilla extract and the lavender lotion she'd used for as long as I could remember. "I just took these out of the oven." "Thanks for coming over," my father added, shuffling his papers into a folder. "We actually have something important to discuss with you." I took a seat at the table, accepting a cookie and the cup of tea my mother placed before me. "That's why I'm here too. Daniel and I need to put down deposits this week to hold our date at Bridal Veil. We've calculated everything and prepared a budget spreadsheet." I pulled out my planner, where I'd organized all the wedding details with color-coded tabs. "We'll need about $14,000 for the initial payments." My parents exchanged a look I couldn't quite interpret. My father cleared his throat, a gesture I recognized from childhood as preceding difficult conversations. "Allie," he said, using my childhood nickname, "there's been a change in circumstances we need to talk about." My mother sat beside him, her hands folded on the table. "Ethan and Megan came to us last month with some news. Megan's pregnant again." "That's wonderful," I said automatically, though I was confused about why this warranted a special discussion about my wedding fund. "When is she due?" "September," my father replied. "But that's not the main issue. Their apartment lease is ending in June, and the landlord is selling the building. They need to find a new place, but with 2 children, they really need more space than another apartment would provide." A subtle uneasiness began to form in the pit of my stomach. I'm sure they'll find something suitable. The rental market has improved since last year. My father tapped his fingers on the folder before him. We've been looking at the situation, and with the second baby coming, their expenses are going to increase significantly. Megan wants to reduce her nursing hours to part-time after the birth. Ethan's photography is bringing in supplemental income, but it's not enough to support a family of 4. We've done some calculations, my mother added, her tone shifting to the practical one she used when discussing household finances. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And we've found a solution that we think works for everyone. My father opened the folder and pushed a real estate listing across the table. It showed a charming Tudor-style house with a front yard and mature oak trees. It's in Selwood. 3 bedrooms plus a home office Ethan could use as a photography studio. Good school district for when Lily's older. The owners are motivated to sell quickly. I stared at the listing, the price circled in my father's precise handwriting. It's beautiful, but I don't understand what this has to do with my wedding. Fund. My mother reached across the table to touch my hand. Sweetie, your father and I have been discussing our family resources and how to allocate them where they're most needed right now. The uneasiness in my stomach hardened into a cold certainty. You're using my wedding money to buy Ethan a house. It wasn't a question, but my father answered anyway. We're helping with the down payment so they can qualify for a mortgage they can afford. With 2 children, they need stability, not a temporary rental solution. But that money was promised to me, I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. You've been telling me for years that you were saving specifically for my wedding. And in an ideal world, we would use it exactly as planned, my father replied, his business negotiation tone emerging. But we have to look at the family's needs holistically. Ethan has a family now, Allie. 2 small children who need a safe, stable home. Daniel and I are also starting a family, I countered. Our wedding is the beginning of that. It's not quite the same, my mother said gently. You and Daniel both have established careers. You've always been responsible with money. You have options and flexibility that your brother doesn't have right now. So I'm being punished for being responsible? The question came out sharper than I'd intended, but the injustice of the situation was beginning to sink in. Nobody's being punished, my father said firmly. We're making a difficult decision about family resources based on current needs. A wedding is important, but it's one day. A stable home for children is years of security. I looked down at my planner with all its carefully organized details, the culmination of not just months of planning, but years of believing in a promise that was apparently conditional. How much of the fund is left? I asked quietly. My parents exchanged another look. About $4,000, my mother admitted. We can still contribute that toward your wedding expenses. $4,000. Less than a third of what we needed just for deposits, and barely a seventh of the total they had promised. The remainder, money that had been explicitly designated for my milestone, had been redirected to my brother's housing needs without any consultation with me. I see, I said, closing my planner and standing up. The cookies and tea remained untouched on the table. I should go. Daniel is waiting for me. Allie, please try to understand, my mother said, rising as well. If there was any other way— There are always other ways, I interrupted, surprising myself with how steady my voice remained despite the hurt churning inside me. You could have helped Ethan find an affordable rental until he builds his business. You could have co-signed a lease instead of buying a house. You could have discussed this with me before making a unilateral decision about money that was promised to me. Sometimes as parents, we have to make difficult choices for the good of the entire family, my father said, his tone suggesting the matter was closed for discussion. And sometimes as adults, we have to recognize when promises don't mean what we thought they did, I replied, gathering my belongings. Thank you for clarifying where priorities stand. I drove home in a state of composed shock, the kind that comes before the full emotional impact hits. Daniel was waiting in our apartment, his hopeful expression fading as soon as he saw my face. They gave the money to Ethan, I said simply, sinking onto our sofa. For a house down payment, because he has a family now. Daniel sat beside me, his arm around my shoulders. All of it? They left us $4,000. The rest is gone. I leaned into his embrace, finally allowing tears of disappointment and betrayal to surface. Apparently, our wedding isn't a priority because we're too responsible to need help. That night, after my initial shock had given way to a more focused disappointment, I sat at our small dining table with my laptop open and a determined resolve settling over me. If my parents wouldn't honor their commitment, I would find another path forward. We have 3 options, I told Daniel, who was making tea in our kitchen. We can dramatically downsize the wedding to match what we can afford now. We can postpone until we've saved enough ourselves. Or we can tap into our house down payment fund and replenish it later. Daniel placed a mug beside my laptop. What do you want to do? I considered the question carefully. The planner and spreadsheets were still open on the table, representing months of careful decisions and excited anticipation. But they also represented a promise that had been broken, a value judgment about the significance of our milestone compared to my brother's needs. I don't want to drain our future home fund, I said finally, and I don't want to wait another year or more to get married. But I also don't want our wedding to be shaped by my parents' broken promise. So we create a 4th option, Daniel suggested, his practical nature one of the many reasons I loved him. We reimagine the wedding on our terms, within our means, without compromising what matters most to us. Over the next 3 weeks, we reconstructed our plans from the ground up. Bridal Veil Gardens became a ceremony at Peninsula Park Rose Garden, a public space that required only a small permit fee. The guest list was trimmed from 90 to 40, our closest friends and family. The catering was replaced by our favorite local restaurant providing a buffet dinner. Daniel's music colleagues agreed to play for the ceremony as their gift to us. Each adjustment required letting go of a previous expectation, but also created space for more creativity and meaning. When I found a vintage dress at a consignment shop for 1/10 of what I'd planned to spend, it felt like a quiet victory. Not because of the savings, but because it represented choosing authenticity over convention. The most difficult decision was whether to tell my brother about what had happened. After careful consideration, I decided against it. Whatever role Ethan might have played in influencing my parents' decision, the responsibility ultimately lay with them. Creating conflict between us wouldn't change the situation and would only cast a shadow over his new home and growing family. When we'd revised our plans completely, I called my parents to inform them of the changes. We've reorganized the wedding to fit our current budget, I explained, my tone professional as if discussing a business arrangement. It will be smaller than originally planned, but still meaningful. We can still contribute the $4,000, my mother offered, her voice carrying a note of guilt beneath the practicality. No, thank you, I replied. Daniel and I have decided to handle this ourselves. We appreciate the offer, but we'd prefer to keep things simple and independent. My refusal wasn't born from spite, but from a newfound understanding of what real security meant, not relying on promises that could be redirected when circumstances changed. 2 weeks later, a housewarming invitation arrived for Ethan and Megan's new home. I decided to attend, bringing a plant and a framed print of one of Ethan's photographs I'd had professionally mounted. If my brother noticed any coolness in my interaction with our parents, he didn't mention it. As he showed me around the house, the spacious kitchen where Megan was already baking, the nursery being prepared for the new baby, the home office set up with his photography equipment, I felt a complex mix of emotions. I was genuinely happy for him and his growing family. The security of this home was undeniably important for my niece and future nephew. Yet, seeing the hardwood floors my parents had just paid to refinish and the custom shelving my father had hired someone to build, I couldn't help but calculate mentally how many aspects of my original wedding plans those expenses would have covered. When my mother pulled me aside in the kitchen to ask about wedding preparations, I kept my responses brief and positive. "Everything's coming together perfectly," I assured her. "It's exactly what Daniel and I want. We'd still like to host the rehearsal dinner," she offered, arranging appetizers on a tray. "It's traditional for the bride's family to handle that part." I nodded non-committally. "I'll let you know once we've finalized the details." The evening concluded with a toast from my father, champagne glasses raised in the spacious living room with its bay windows and built-in bookshelves. "To new beginnings and growing families," he said, beaming at Ethan and Megan. "This home represents our family values of security, stability, and supporting one another through life's journey." The irony of his words wasn't lost on me, but I smiled and raised my glass along with everyone else. On the drive home, Daniel reached for my hand across the console. "Are you okay?" he asked, knowing me well enough to sense the emotions I was keeping contained. "I'm processing," I replied honestly. "Not just about the wedding fund, but about what this reveals about my place in the family equation. It seems my life choices, being responsible, planning carefully, not needing constant rescuing, have somehow made me less worthy of support during important milestones." "Or maybe," Daniel suggested gently, "it's just that your parents are imperfect humans who made a poor decision while trying to solve multiple family needs at once." His perspective wasn't wrong, but it didn't address the underlying pattern I was beginning to recognize: how my independence had been used against me, translated into a justification for withdrawing support rather than celebrating self-sufficiency. That night, I made two important decisions. First, Daniel and I would proceed with our scaled-down wedding plans with genuine enthusiasm, creating a celebration that reflected our values rather than external expectations. Second, I would channel my hurt and disappointment into something productive, accelerating my professional goals and financial independence even further. The following Monday, I requested a meeting with my director at Westridge Creative. "I'd like to discuss taking on additional responsibilities," I told her, presenting a proposal I developed over the weekend. "Specifically, I see an opportunity to expand our services into the tech startup sector that's growing in Portland." My careful research and strategic approach impressed her. By the end of the week, I had approval to develop a specialized marketing package for tech startups, along with a modest budget increase and the promise of a performance review in 6 months, rather than the standard annual evaluation. Parallel to this professional initiative, I began a side consulting business focusing on brand development for small businesses, working evenings and occasional weekends. Daniel supported this increased workload, understanding it wasn't just about additional income, but about reclaiming a sense of agency. Our wedding took place on a perfect October afternoon, the Peninsula Park Rose Garden still showing the last blooms of the season. 40 guests witnessed our ceremony, followed by dinner at a local restaurant where the owner had created a special menu featuring our favorite dishes. My vintage dress received more compliments than any expensive gown could have, and Daniel's colleagues performed music that moved several guests to tears. My parents attended, of course, bringing a crystal vase as a gift and offering awkwardly worded congratulations that skirted around the elephant in the room. How different this celebration was from what had been planned and promised. If they noticed that I had assigned my closest friend rather than my mother to help with final dress preparations, or that Daniel's father rather than mine made the primary toast at dinner, they didn't mention it. The day was beautiful in its authenticity and intimacy. As Daniel and I danced under market lights on the restaurant's covered patio, I realized something important. The wedding we created ourselves, unburdened by external expectations or conditional Support was more meaningful than the more elaborate event we'd originally planned. This realization didn't erase the hurt of broken promises or the revealing insights about family dynamics, but it did provide a foundation for moving forward with clearer eyes and stronger boundaries. In choosing to create our own celebration, rather than compromising our financial future or postponing our marriage, we had declared our values and priorities, not in opposition to my family, but independent of them. The months following our wedding brought significant changes. My tech startup initiative at Westridge exceeded projections, resulting in an early promotion and substantial bonus. My side consulting business gained steady clients through referrals, creating a secondary income stream that Daniel and I directed entirely into savings. We maintained our modest living arrangements, now with a specific timeline for when we would be ready to purchase our own home. Meanwhile, Ethan and Megan welcomed their son, named Richard after our father. The family seemed to be thriving in their new home, with Ethan's photography business slowly growing and Megan working reduced hours as planned. At family gatherings, I maintained a polite but somewhat distant relationship with my parents, engaging enthusiastically with my niece and nephew while keeping conversations with the adults pleasant but superficial. "You seem different," my mother observed during a Christmas celebration, finding me alone in the kitchen. "More reserved." "I've been focused on work," I replied, with a smile that didn't invite further discussion. The promotion came with additional responsibilities. The truth was more complex than I could express in that moment. I had indeed changed. Not out of bitterness, but from a fundamental shift in how I understood my family relationships. The wedding fund situation had removed a veil of assumptions about unconditional support and equal consideration, revealing that my parents' assistance was allocated based on perceived need rather than equitable treatment or honoring commitments. This understanding didn't make me love my family less, but it did transform how I positioned myself within those relationships. I no longer expected validation or support from my parents in the way I once had. Instead, I built my life with Daniel based on our shared values of reliability, transparency, and mutual support, creating the foundation I wanted rather than replicating the one I'd grown up with. 18 months after our wedding, Daniel and I achieved our revised financial goal. With my promotion, his recent appointment as music department chair, and the consistent income from my consulting work, we had accumulated enough for a substantial down payment on a home. We worked with a real estate agent to find a craftsman bungalow in a neighborhood we loved, not as spacious as Ethan's Tudor, but perfect for our needs, with a sunroom Daniel could use as a music studio and a yard where we could plant the garden. We'd been planning. The day we signed the final paperwork and received the keys, we didn't immediately share the news with my family. This milestone felt private, something we had achieved entirely through our own efforts and choices. That evening, as we sat on the floor of our empty living room sharing takeout and planning furniture arrangements, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment, not just in owning a home, but in creating a life that reflected our values rather than external expectations. "We should have a housewarming," Daniel suggested, opening a bottle of champagne we'd brought to celebrate. "Nothing elaborate, just close friends and family." I hesitated, considering what it would mean to invite my parents into this space that represented our independent success. "I think you're right," I said finally. "It's time to write the next chapter." The day after our housewarming party, I was still processing my parents' revelation. The knowledge that they had redirected funds from a trust my grandfather had, specifically established for my wedding, not just their own personal savings, had added an additional layer of betrayal to an already painful situation. I sat at our new dining room table with the check, trust documents, and their letter of apology spread before me, trying to determine how I truly felt about this unexpected development. Daniel brought me coffee and sat across from me, his expression thoughtful. "You haven't said much since they left yesterday. Where's your head at with all this?" "Honestly, I'm conflicted," I admitted. On one hand, their acknowledgement that this was a genuine breach of trust rather than just a difficult family decision feels validating. On the other hand, it took us proving our complete self-sufficiency for them to finally recognize the harm they caused. "Do you think the timing diminishes the sincerity of their apology?" Daniel asked. I considered this question carefully. Not exactly. I believe they're genuinely sorry, but I wonder if they would have ever come clean if we hadn't succeeded on our own. There's something about seeing us achieve this milestone without their help that seems to have triggered this confession. Perhaps seeing what you've accomplished independently made them realize they can't dismiss your feelings by framing you as overreacting to a necessary family decision, Daniel suggested. Your success removed their ability to position you as the unreasonable daughter who couldn't understand family priorities. His insight resonated with me. Throughout my life, my self-sufficiency had been used against me. First as justification for providing less support than Ethan received, and later as a reason why I should simply accept the redirection of my wedding fund. My independence had been weaponized to minimize the impact of broken promises. "I'm going to deposit this check," I decided finally. Not because we need it, but because accepting it acknowledges the legitimacy of what was taken from me. Refusing it would let them frame this as me being stubborn, rather than them making proper restitution. Daniel nodded. That makes sense. What about their broader apology? Do you feel ready to move toward reconciliation? I think I need more than words and money, I said slowly. I need to see actual changes in how they relate to both of us. Not just me getting more attention, but a fundamental shift in the patterns that led to the wedding fund situation in the first place. The opportunity to observe whether such changes were forthcoming came sooner than expected. The following weekend, we received a call from Ethan inviting us to Sunday dinner at our parents' house. Dad says he has an important announcement to make, and he wants both families there, Ethan explained, sounding uncertain. Any idea what this is about? None, I replied honestly, but I guess we'll find out tomorrow. When we arrived at my parents' home that Sunday, I felt a subtle tension underlying the usual family gathering atmosphere. My father seemed preoccupied, my mother more attentive than usual to ensuring everyone had what they needed. Ethan and Megan arrived shortly after us, their children immediately livening the atmosphere with their energy. After dinner, as we moved to the living room for coffee and dessert, my father cleared his throat, a familiar signal that he was about to address something significant. I've asked you all here because I've made some important decisions regarding the future of Parker Electrical, he began, his tone more formal than usual for a family gathering. After 35 years of building and running the business, I've decided it's time to begin planning for succession and eventual retirement. This wasn't entirely surprising. My father was approaching his mid-60s, but the timing and formal announcement suggested something more significant than just preliminary retirement thoughts. I've always assumed the business would eventually be passed to the next generation, he continued. But I've never been explicit about what that might look like or how decisions would be made. Recent events have made me realize the importance of transparency and clear communication when it comes to family resources and inheritances. At this, his eyes met mine briefly, acknowledging the connection to our recent conversation about the mishandled trust fund. Parker Electrical has grown well beyond my initial vision, he said. We now have commercial contracts throughout the Pacific Northwest, 27 employees, and a solid reputation in the industry. The company represents not just my life's work, but our family's primary asset. My mother reached over to squeeze his hand, a gesture of support I'd seen countless times throughout their marriage. After considerable thought and consultation, with our financial advisors, I've decided to restructure the company ownership in preparation for eventual transition, my father announced. I'm establishing a family business trust that will hold controlling interest in Parker Electrical. Allison and Ethan will serve as co-trustees, each with equal voting rights regarding major company decisions. The announcement landed with quiet force in the room. Throughout my childhood and early adulthood, there had been an unspoken assumption that Ethan, as the son, would eventually take over the family business, despite showing little interest in electrical contracting or business management. My own potential role had never been discussed, though I had the business education and experience that would translate well to company leadership. Additionally, my father continued, I've drafted a formal succession plan that will transfer operational control over the next 5 years. This transition will be based on merit, interest, and qualification, not gender or birth order. The explicit rejection of traditional patrilineal succession was significant. In one statement, my father had dismantled decades of implicit assumptions about how family resources would be distributed. Dad, this is unexpected, Ethan said, looking somewhat bewildered. I always thought you wanted me to take over the company eventually, even though it's not really my thing. That was the traditional assumption, my father acknowledged. But it doesn't make practical sense given your career path and interests. More importantly, making decisions based on outdated expectations rather than individual capabilities and desires led to the situation with Allison's wedding fund, a mistake I don't intend to repeat with the family business. I sat in stunned silence, processing the implications of this announcement. This wasn't just about business succession. It was a fundamental restructuring of family power dynamics. My father was creating a formal system that required Ethan and me to collaborate as equals, removing his own unilateral decision-making authority in the process. I don't expect either of you to leave your current careers and start working at Parker Electrical tomorrow, my father clarified. The trust structure allows for professional management under your joint oversight. What matters is that decisions about the company's future will be made transparently and equitably. What prompted this now? I asked, finding my voice. This seems like a significant shift in your thinking about the business. My father met my gaze directly. The trust fund situation forced me to examine other places where I might be making assumptions or decisions that could damage family relationships. Parker Electrical is the most significant asset I'll leave behind, not just financially, but as a legacy. I want that legacy to strengthen our family, not become a source of division. After the initial announcement, the conversation shifted to practical details, how the trust would be structured, the timeline for transition, the role of current management during the change. Throughout the discussion, I observed subtle but significant differences in how my father engaged with Ethan and me. He asked for my input on business valuation approaches. With the same deference, he sought Ethan's thoughts on retaining key employees. He didn't assume either of us had more relevant expertise based on gender or personality, but addressed questions to whoever had the most appropriate background for each topic. Later that evening, as Daniel and I drove home, I was still processing the implications of my father's announcement. That was quite a statement, Daniel observed, especially coming so soon after the trust fund revelation. It's almost too perfect, I admitted. Part of me wonders if this is just an elaborate gesture rather than a genuine change in perspective. What makes you skeptical? Daniel asked. I considered this as we turned onto our street. It addresses exactly what hurt me most about the wedding fund situation, being treated as less entitled to family resources despite being more qualified to manage them. It's almost like he read a psychology textbook about family dynamics and implemented the perfect solution. Or maybe, Daniel suggested as we pulled into our driveway, your parents have genuinely been reflecting on their patterns and recognized what needs to change. The trust fund situation might have been the catalyst they needed to examine other potential problems before they occurred. I wanted to believe this more generous interpretation, but years of observing my parents' consistent patterns made me cautious. I guess we'll see whether this represents a real shift or just an elaborate apology gesture. The test will be in how they implement these changes over time. The following weekend, I received an unexpected email from my father with the subject line, "Parker Electrical Financials, for your review." Attached were detailed company financial statements, valuation reports, and the draft trust documents he had mentioned at dinner. The email itself was brief but significant. "Allison, I realize I've never shared the company's financial details with you, despite your business background. As you prepare to take on co-trustee responsibilities, I want to ensure you have complete access to this information. I've scheduled a meeting with our company's CFO next Tuesday at 2 p.m. if you're available and interested in discussing these materials. Your insight would be valuable. Dad." The transparency of sharing these documents, information I had never been privy to despite my MBA and corporate experience, felt like a meaningful step toward the equal treatment my father had promised. More significant was the acknowledgement of my professional expertise and the invitation to provide input. I forwarded the email to Daniel with a brief note. Maybe I was too cynical? His reply came quickly. "Worth keeping an open mind. Actions speak louder than words, and this seems like action." I spent the weekend reviewing the materials my father had sent. Parker Electrical was more successful than I had realized, with solid growth over the past decade and strategic expansions into commercial automation systems that positioned the company well for future development. The draft trust documents were meticulously fair, with provisions that protected both Ethan's and my interests, while ensuring neither could override the other without significant cause. Tuesday afternoon, I arrived at Parker Electrical's headquarters, a modest office building, with a large warehouse attached where equipment and supplies were stored. I had visited occasionally throughout my life, but had never been invited into the business operations before. My father met me in the reception area, his expression a mix of professional pride and personal uncertainty. "Thank you for coming," he said, his formality suggesting he was navigating unfamiliar emotional territory. "Lisa is set up in the conference room with the quarterly projections. Before we join her, do you have any initial questions about the materials I sent?" "Actually, yes," I replied, pulling out my tablet where I'd made notes. "I'm particularly interested in the commercial automation division. The growth rate there is impressive, but the profit margins seem thinner than your traditional electrical contracting work. Is that a strategic choice to gain market share, or is there a plan to improve profitability over time?" A look of genuine surprise crossed my father's face, followed by what appeared to be respect. "That's an excellent observation. We've been deliberately pricing competitively to establish ourselves in that sector. The 5-year plan includes a shift toward more custom solutions with higher margins once we've secured a client base." The meeting that followed was unlike any interaction I'd ever had with my father. He introduced me to Lisa, the company's CFO, not as my daughter, but as Allison Parker, who will be joining the trust leadership. Throughout the 2-hour discussion, he actively sought my perspective on financial projections, market strategy, and organizational structure. When I suggested a different approach to evaluating acquisition opportunities, he didn't immediately dismiss it, but asked thoughtful questions about implementation. As the meeting concluded and Lisa excused herself, my father remained seated, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. "You have good instincts for this business," he said finally. "Better than mine in some areas, particularly regarding the digital transformation opportunities. I should have involved you years ago." The acknowledgement hung in the air between us, not just of my capabilities, but of the missed opportunity for connection through shared professional interest. "It wasn't something I expected," I admitted. "The family narrative always positioned Ethan as your business successor, even though his interests clearly lay elsewhere." My father nodded slowly. "That was my failure of imagination. I was following the script my own father established. Son takes over the family business, daughter pursues her own path. I never questioned whether that made sense for who you and Ethan actually are. Have you talked with Ethan about these changes? I asked. This restructuring affects his expected inheritance too. I have, my father confirmed. His reaction was primarily relief. He admitted he's been feeling pressure about eventually taking over a business he has limited interest in. The photography studio he's setting up in their home is where his passion lies. As we walked toward the parking lot, my father continued, I've been thinking a lot about the patterns I established in our family, how I measured value and distributed support. I'm not proud of how those patterns affected you and Ethan's relationship or your sense of worth within the family. It wasn't just you, I acknowledged, surprising myself with this concession. Mom reinforced those dynamics too, and Ethan and I played our assigned roles without questioning them until recently. Still, my father said as we reached my car, as the head of the family and the one who controlled the financial resources, I set the tone. The wedding fund situation was just the most obvious manifestation of inequities I'd been perpetuating for years. I'm trying to correct that now, not just with money, but with how I engage with both of you. The sincerity in his voice and the concrete actions he'd taken, sharing financial information, seeking my professional input, restructuring the business inheritance, suggested this wasn't merely an elaborate apology gesture, but a genuine attempt to reshape our family dynamics. For the first time since the wedding fund revelation, I felt a sense of cautious optimism about our relationship moving forward. As I drove home, I found myself reflecting on how fundamentally my perspective had shifted in the weeks since our housewarming party. The revelation about the trust fund had initially felt like another layer of betrayal, but my father's subsequent actions had transformed it into something else, an opening for more honest communication and structural change within our family system. When I arrived home, Daniel was in the backyard, planting native shrubs along the fence line we shared with our elderly neighbor. I watched him for a moment through the kitchen window, appreciating his careful attention to spacing and soil preparation. His meticulous approach to gardening mirrored his thoughtfulness in our relationship. Patient, attentive to details, focused on long-term flourishing rather than immediate results. You look deep in thought, he said when I joined him, handing me a pair of gardening gloves without prompting. He knew me well enough to understand that physical activity helped me process complex emotions. As I knelt beside him and began loosening soil for the next plant, I described the meeting with my father and Lisa, the unexpected respect he'd shown for my business acumen, and the genuine regret he'd expressed about excluding me from company matters in the past. It felt different, I concluded, patting soil around a young Oregon grape. Not just him being on his best behavior because he feels guilty, but like he's genuinely reconsidering assumptions he's held his entire life. Daniel nodded, considering this. That kind of introspection doesn't happen often, especially for someone his age who's been successful operating from a particular worldview. What do you think catalyzed it? I think seeing us achieve this milestone completely independently forced him to confront the narrative he'd been using to justify redirecting the wedding fund, I said. As long as he could frame me as the overreacting daughter who didn't understand family priorities, he could avoid facing what the decision really represented. Valuing Ethan's needs over promises made to me. And your success removed that convenient framing, Daniel observed. Exactly. It's harder to dismiss someone's hurt as unreasonable when they prove they can succeed without your help. I sat back on my heels, hands resting on my soil-covered knees. But I think there's more to it than that. The trust fund revelation seems to have triggered some deeper reflection about patterns he established in our family, positioning Ethan as needing rescue while taking my self-sufficiency for granted. Daniel handed me another plant, a flowering currant that would attract hummingbirds next spring. Do you think he would have come to these realizations without the catalyst of seeing our independent success? Honestly, probably not, I admitted. But I'm not sure that diminishes the significance of the changes he's making now. Maybe some reckonings require external circumstances to force self-examination. That seems fair, Daniel agreed. The important thing is what he does with the insight now that he has it. Over the following weeks, my father's commitment to changing these family patterns became increasingly evident. He scheduled regular meetings to discuss the business transition, always including both Ethan and me, and consistently demonstrated respect for our different perspectives and expertise. When Ethan expressed interest in documenting the company's history through photography for their upcoming 35th anniversary, my father provided resources and access without questioning the project's value. When I suggested restructuring their commercial bidding process to focus on higher-margin projects, he implemented the changes immediately and publicly credited me with the idea at the next staff meeting. My mother, too, seemed to be reevaluating her role in maintaining the family's dysfunctional patterns. She invited me to lunch one rainy Tuesday in late October, selecting a quiet cafe where we could talk without interruption. "I've been thinking about our family dynamics," she said after we'd ordered, surprising me with her directness. My mother typically approached difficult topics circuitously, testing the conversational waters before committing to a challenging subject. "Particularly about how differently your father and I treated you and Ethan." I set down my water glass carefully. "I'm listening. I always told myself we were responding to your different personalities and needs," she continued. "That you were naturally independent while Ethan needed more guidance and support. But looking back, I can see how we helped create those traits by treating you differently from the beginning." The admission surprised me. Throughout my childhood, my mother had been the primary enforcer of the family's implicit rules and roles, often framing them as natural reflections of our inherent personalities, rather than constructed dynamics. "We expected perfection from you almost from the time you could walk," she acknowledged. "When you achieved it, instead of celebrating your success, we simply raised the bar higher. With Ethan, every small step in the right direction received enthusiastic support and recognition." "That's an accurate summary," I agreed, unsure where this conversation was heading. My mother reached across the table to cover my hand with hers, a gesture she rarely initiated. "I want you to know that I recognize my role in establishing those patterns, Allison, not just your father's. I was the one who often communicated the different expectations day to day, who translated his values into the practical dynamics of our home." The acknowledgement of her specific responsibility, separate from my father's, felt significant. Throughout their marriage, my mother had rarely distinguished her perspective from his, presenting a unified front even when disagreements might have existed privately. "When the wedding fund situation happened," she continued, "I told myself we were making a necessary choice for the family's overall well-being. But if I'm completely honest, I knew we were breaking a promise to you that we would have moved heaven and earth to keep for Ethan. I justified it because you've always found ways to succeed regardless of obstacles. You used my strength against me," I said quietly. She nodded, her eyes reflecting genuine regret. "Yes. Instead of honoring your resilience, we exploited it. That wasn't fair, and I'm deeply sorry for my part in it." Her apology lacked the qualifications or justifications that typically accompanied my parents' rare acknowledgments of error. There was no, "but we thought it was best at the time," or "you have to understand the position we were in." Just a clean, direct recognition of the harm caused and her specific role in creating it. "What prompted this reflection?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Watching how you've handled this situation," she replied. "You've maintained your dignity without becoming bitter. You've created beautiful alternatives to what was taken from you. You've remained generous with Ethan and his children despite having every reason to resent them." She paused, seeming to search for the right words. It made me question what I've always told myself about needing to protect Ethan while pushing you to achieve more. You've demonstrated more emotional maturity in handling this betrayal than I've shown in my own life. Her candor created an opening for a question I'd wondered about for years. Were you ever uncomfortable with how differently you and Dad treated us? Did you ever question it privately? A flash of what looked like relief crossed her face, as though grateful for the opportunity to discuss something long suppressed. Yes, particularly after your college graduation. You'd achieved exceptional honors, secured an impressive job offer, and organized most of the celebration yourself. We acknowledged it briefly, then spent the rest of the evening discussing Ethan's summer plans and whether he should change his major again. I remembered that evening clearly. The culmination of 4 years of intensive work reduced to a passing congratulation, while my brother's indecision about his educational path dominated the family conversation. I remember lying awake that night feeling like we'd failed you, my mother continued. Not because we hadn't helped you succeed. You'd managed that beautifully on your own, but because we hadn't properly celebrated or acknowledged your achievements. I mentioned it to your father the next morning, but he dismissed it, saying you didn't need the validation as much as Ethan needed direction. And you accepted his assessment, I observed, not accusingly, but seeking to understand the dynamic. I did, she acknowledged. I've spent most of our marriage deferring to his judgment about family matters, particularly financial ones. That's something I'm working to change now. The trust fund situation made me realize that my silence can cause as much harm as active mistreatment. As our lunch progressed, we moved into territory we'd never explored, my mother's own upbringing. In a household where daughters were explicitly valued less than sons, her struggle to establish professional credibility in her early career, her complex feelings about setting aside her educational administration work to support my father's growing business and our family needs. I think I overcompensated with you, she admitted as we waited for our check. I was determined you wouldn't face the limitations I did, so I pushed you to achieve impossible standards, to be so exceptional that no one could dismiss you. But, in doing so, I failed to give you the emotional support and celebration you deserved. I think I understand that better now than I would have before, I said, surprising myself with the empathy I felt. Having to prove ourselves often makes us impose even higher standards on those who come after us. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret, pride mixed with something like wistfulness. When did you get so wise about family dynamics? Probably around the time I had to reimagine my wedding and rebuild my understanding of my place in our family, I replied honestly. Nothing clarifies perspective quite like having fundamental assumptions shattered. As we prepared to leave, the cafe? My mother hesitated, then asked, "Would you be willing to help me with something? The family business transition has highlighted how much I've deferred to your father on financial matters throughout our marriage. I'd like to develop more independence in that area, and given your financial acumen." The request represented another shift in our relationship. My mother acknowledging my expertise and seeking my guidance rather than offering unsolicited advice or subtle criticism. I'd be happy to, I said, meaning it. We could start with a basic overview of your current financial situation and develop a system that gives you more visibility and control. Over the following months, these individual conversations with my parents evolved into a broader restructuring of our family dynamics. My father established quarterly family meetings to discuss not just business matters, but any significant decisions affecting the extended family. These gatherings included Daniel and Megan as full participants rather than peripheral in-laws, acknowledging their equal stake in family outcomes. My mother began taking a more active role in financial decisions, both personally and in the family business. She enrolled in financial literacy courses and gradually assumed responsibility for the company's community engagement initiatives, an area where her background in education provided valuable perspective. Perhaps most significantly, Ethan and I began developing a more authentic relationship, one based on mutual respect for our different strengths, rather than the competitive dynamic our parents had inadvertently fostered. He consulted me about business aspects of his growing photography practice. I sought his creative input on marketing, materials for my consulting clients. We discovered common ground we'd never explored, including shared memories of our childhood that we'd interpreted through very different lenses. Do you remember that summer at Lake Chelan when Dad taught us to water ski? Ethan asked during a rare siblings-only dinner we'd arranged in early December. I was thinking about it recently when Lily wanted to try paddleboarding. I nodded, recalling the family vacation when I was 12 and Ethan 9. You got up on the skis on your second try. I fell probably 15 times before I managed to stay upright. That's not how I remember it, Ethan said, looking surprised. In my memory, you mastered it almost immediately, and I spent the whole week feeling inadequate because Dad kept saying, "Watch how Allie does it," every time I fell. The disparity in our recollections stunned me. Really? I remember Mom comforting you after each successful run, saying things like, "Ethan's a natural athlete," while Dad told me I needed to analyze less and feel more when I struggled. Ethan shook his head slowly. It's amazing how differently we experience the same events. I always thought I was the family disappointment, never quite measuring up to your achievements, requiring extra support and attention just to reach baseline expectations. While I felt my achievements were taken for granted while your every effort was celebrated, I added, the irony not lost on me. We were both responding to the roles they assigned us, Ethan observed. You became increasingly self-sufficient because your successes weren't acknowledged unless they were exceptional. I remained dependent longer because every small step received disproportionate recognition. Neither pattern served us particularly well, I acknowledged. Though I suppose my enforced self-reliance has proven useful in building my career and navigating setbacks. And my comfort with asking for help made it easier to build a support network when starting my photography business, Ethan added, though it's taken me longer to develop confidence in my independent decisions. As we continued exploring these parallel but contrasting experiences of our shared childhood, I found myself developing a new appreciation for Ethan's perspective. His constant comparison to my academic and professional achievements had created its own form of pressure, different from but no less real than the perfectionistic standards I'd internalized. I want you to know, I said as we prepared to leave the restaurant, that I never resented you for the wedding fund situation. I was hurt and angry with Mom and Dad for breaking their promise and dismissing the importance of my milestone, but I never blamed you for accepting their help with the house. I still feel terrible about it, Ethan admitted, especially now that I know the money came from Grandpa's trust for you. If I'd known, I would never have accepted it. You had no way of knowing, I assured him. They presented it as their personal funds, a family decision about resource allocation. The responsibility was theirs, not yours. He nodded, though his expression suggested he still carried some guilt about benefiting from what had been taken from me. Megan and I have been discussing ways we might contribute to making this right. Not financially. I understand Mom and Dad have handled that restitution, but in terms of acknowledging the milestone that was diminished. His thoughtfulness touched me. That's not necessary, Ethan. Daniel and I had a beautiful wedding, different from what we originally planned, but meaningful in its authenticity. Still, he insisted, family should celebrate important transitions together. We'd like to host a special anniversary dinner for you and Daniel when your first anniversary comes around. Something that honors your marriage milestone the way it should have been acknowledged from the beginning. The offer represented something significant. Not just a gesture of reconciliation, but recognition of the specific harm that had been done. Not the financial loss which my parents' restitution had addressed, but the diminishment of a life milestone that deserved family celebration and support. I'd like that, I said, genuinely moved by his perception of what had really been lost in the wedding fund situation. As winter settled over Portland, bringing its characteristic gray skies and persistent drizzle, Daniel and I focused on making our home a warm retreat from the elements. We hung thick curtains in the living room, placed area rugs over the original hardwood floors, and installed a new energy-efficient fireplace insert that transformed our drafty fireplace into a genuine source of heat. The house took on a cozy intimacy in this season, the patina of age on its woodwork and fixtures feeling like character rather than wear. In this atmosphere of domestic contentment, we began discussing a topic we'd set aside during the turbulence of the wedding fund situation and subsequent home buying process: starting a family of our own. "I've been thinking," Daniel said one evening as we sat before the fire, mugs of spiced cider in hand, "that this might be a good time to revisit our family planning conversations. The house is established, your consulting business is stable alongside your primary work, and my department chair position is secured for at least the next 3 years." "I've been thinking about it too," I admitted, "particularly since the trust fund revelation and seeing how my parents are genuinely working to change the family dynamics. It makes me feel more optimistic about potential grandparent relationships than I did immediately after the wedding fund situation." "That's significant," Daniel observed. "I know you were concerned about replicating unhealthy patterns if we had children." He was right. In the immediate aftermath of discovering my parents had redirected my wedding fund to Ethan's house, I had experienced serious doubts about bringing children into a family system where comparative worth seemed built into the generational patterns. Would my children constantly be measured against Ethan's? Would the uneven treatment I had experienced be repeated with the next generation? I think the structured changes they're making, equal trusts for all grandchildren, transparent decision-making processes, formal recognition of each family member's voice, provide some protection against history repeating itself, I said. And more importantly, I feel more equipped to establish and maintain boundaries if necessary. Daniel nodded. Your relationship with your parents has evolved significantly. You're engaging from a position of adult equality rather than seeking approval or validation. Exactly. Having children wouldn't mean surrendering to their value system or accepting their judgment about my worth as a parent. We'd be creating our own family culture while allowing our children to benefit from the positive aspects of extended family connections. As we discussed practical considerations, timing, career adjustments, financial planning, I felt a sense of empowerment that contrasted sharply with the vulnerability I'd experienced during the wedding fund betrayal. That situation had forced me to recognize and address dysfunctional family patterns that might otherwise have continued unexamined. In rebuilding relationships on more honest and equitable terms, we had created a healthier foundation for bringing children into our extended family. 2 weeks later, I scheduled lunch with Lisa, the CFO of Parker Electrical, to discuss questions that had emerged from my review of the company's financial projections. My father had explicitly encouraged me to develop independent professional relationships with key company personnel, rather than filtering all interactions through him. Another small but significant shift in family business dynamics. These 5-year projections are solid, Lisa commented as we reviewed the documents I'd brought. But I'm curious about your questions regarding the commercial automation division. That's been your father's pet project for the past 3 years. I'm interested in understanding the strategic vision behind the current pricing structure, I explained. The margins are significantly lower than industry standard, which makes sense for market penetration, but I don't see a clear timeline for transitioning to more profitable service models. Lisa studied me for a moment, seeming to evaluate how candid she could be. Between us, that's been a point of discussion among the executive team. Your father has resisted establishing firm timelines for moving beyond the initial market entry pricing. Any insight into why? I asked, genuinely curious rather than critical. He's built this company on personal relationships and reputation, she said. The prevailing theory among the leadership team is that he's concerned about alienating the new client base he's worked so hard to establish in the automation sector. Her observation aligned with my understanding of my father's business philosophy, prioritizing long-term relationships over short-term profit maximization. However, it also highlighted a potential blind spot in his strategic planning. "I appreciate that perspective," I said. "Would you be open to collaborating on a transition model that maintains those client relationships while gradually improving margins through expanded service offerings rather than simple price increases?" Lisa's expression brightened. "Actually, I have some preliminary models along those lines that I've been hesitant to present because they represent a departure from the current approach. I'd welcome your input before taking them to the broader team." As we delved into the financial models she pulled up on her tablet, I found myself engaged in exactly the kind of strategic business thinking I most enjoyed, identifying opportunities for sustainable growth that balanced financial performance with relationship preservation. It struck me that this collaboration represented yet another unexpected positive outcome from the wedding fund situation. Without that catalyst forcing a reevaluation of family roles and resource allocation, I might never have been invited into the company's strategic planning process. When I shared insights from this meeting with my father later that week, his response further confirmed the evolution in our relationship. Rather than feeling threatened by my independent interaction with his leadership team or defensive about questions regarding his pet project, he listened attentively to the alternative approach Lisa and I had outlined. "This addresses concerns I hadn't fully articulated even to myself," he acknowledged when I finished presenting. "I've been reluctant to set specific timelines for margin improvement because I'm wary of damaging client relationships, but your phased approach through expanded services rather than price adjustments provides a path forward that aligns with our company values. It builds on the foundation you've established," I pointed out. "The client relationships and reputation you've developed create the opportunity for these expanded service offerings." He nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "You know, I've spent decades thinking about who would eventually lead this company when I retire. I always assumed it would be Ethan because that's how my generation approached family business. Succession. But watching you engage with these business challenges, it's clear you have both the technical skills and the relationship orientation that's been central to our success." The observation hung between us. Not a declaration that I should leave my established career to join the family business, but an acknowledgement that my capabilities aligned with the company's needs in ways he hadn't previously recognized. "I'm not suggesting you abandon your current path," he clarified, reading my expression accurately. "But I want you to know that your involvement in the business, at whatever level works for your life, is valued not just because you're my daughter, but because you bring genuine expertise and perspective that benefit the company. This distinction, being valued for my specific contributions rather than merely included out of obligation or guilt, represented a fundamental shift in our relationship. Throughout my life, I had oscillated between seeking my father's approval and asserting independence from his judgment. Now we were establishing a new dynamic based on mutual professional respect alongside our family connection. That evening, I shared this conversation with Daniel as we prepared dinner together in our partially renovated kitchen. The restitution funds from my parents had allowed us to replace the outdated appliances and worn countertops, though we were saving for more extensive cabinet work later. It's interesting, I reflected as I chopped vegetables for a stir-fry, how the wedding fund situation has ultimately led to opportunities I wouldn't have had otherwise. Not just professional ones, but the chance to develop more authentic relationships with my family. Daniel nodded, measuring rice into the cooker. Crisis often forces reckonings that comfort allows us to postpone indefinitely. Without that betrayal bringing dysfunctional patterns into stark relief, your parents might never have recognized the need for fundamental changes in how the family operates. That doesn't justify what they did, I clarified quickly. Of course, not, Daniel agreed. But it does suggest that sometimes painful revelations create openings for growth that wouldn't exist otherwise. You've all done the difficult work of addressing the underlying issues rather than simply patching over the immediate conflict. His observation resonated with my own sense that the wedding fund situation had ultimately catalyzed necessary transformations. in our family system. The betrayal had been painful, but the healing process had created something stronger and more authentic than what existed before. The depth of these changes became even more apparent the following week when my mother called with an unexpected invitation. "Your father and I are considering downsizing," she explained. "The house is larger than we need now, and the maintenance is becoming more than we want to manage. We've been looking at some condominiums in that new development near the river." "That makes sense," I replied, a bit surprised they were considering such a significant change. My parents had lived in the same house for nearly 30 years, gradually updating it, but maintaining the essential character that had defined my childhood home. "We'd like your input," she continued. "Both practical advice about the financial aspects of downsizing and your perspective on how this might affect family gatherings moving forward. We're having Ethan and Megan over on Saturday to discuss it, and we hoped you and Daniel could join us." The invitation to participate in this major life decision represented another shift in family dynamics. Previously, my parents would have made such a choice independently, presenting it to Ethan and me as a fait accompli rather than seeking our input during the decision-making process. "We'd be happy to be part of the conversation," I said. "What time should we come over?" That Saturday, the 6 adults gathered in my parents' living room after lunch, the children having been sent to play in the backyard despite the light January drizzle. My father had prepared a presentation outlining their current thinking, financial projections for selling the house versus maintaining it, comparisons of various condominium options they'd toured, considerations about space for family gatherings, and visiting grandchildren. "Before we go further," he said, after completing the initial overview, "I want to emphasize that we're genuinely seeking input, not simply informing you of a decision we've already made. This transition would affect all of us in various ways, and we want to honor that in our planning process." The explicit statement of collaborative intent set the tone for a discussion unlike any our family had previously conducted. Ethan expressed concerns about maintaining space for family traditions like Christmas morning gift exchanges. Megan asked thoughtful questions about accessibility features in the condominium options, thinking ahead to my parents' potential future mobility needs. Daniel offered insights about the real estate market based on our recent home buying experience. I found myself contributing both financial analysis regarding the long-term implications of various options and personal reflection about what aspects of the family home held genuine emotional significance worth preserving in some form. "The physical structure itself isn't what matters most to me," I acknowledged. "But certain traditions associated with this space, Sunday dinners in the dining room, watching the 4th of July fireworks from the back deck, the way the morning light comes through the kitchen windows, those hold meaningful memories. If we could translate those experiential elements into new traditions in a different space, the transition would feel more like evolution than loss." My mother's eyes glistened slightly at this observation. "That's exactly what I've been struggling to articulate to myself," she admitted. "It's not the house itself, but the experiences it has contained that I'm hesitant to leave behind." This moment of shared vulnerability opened a deeper conversation about the meaning of home, the nature of family continuity, and how transitions might honor the past while creating space for new patterns. We eventually developed a collaborative approach to the potential move, identifying specific elements of the current home that held genuine significance, exploring how those aspects might be preserved or reinterpreted in a new space, and establishing a timeline that allowed for proper farewells to the family home while embracing the benefits of a more manageable living situation. As we prepared to leave that evening, my father pulled me aside briefly. "Thank you for engaging so thoughtfully in this discussion," he said. "There was a time when I might have made this decision unilaterally, expecting everyone to simply adjust to whatever your mother and I determined was best. I'm learning that including more perspectives actually leads to better outcomes, not just emotionally, but practically." His acknowledgement of this shift in approach represented genuine growth, not just modified behavior designed to appease me after the wedding fund betrayal, but a fundamental reconsideration of how family decisions should be made. The seasonal transition from winter to spring brought renewed energy to our household projects. Daniel and I spent weekends preparing garden beds, refinishing the original windows to improve their energy efficiency, and planning the bathroom renovation that would be our next major home improvement project. During this period of domestic focus, I received an unexpected job offer, a senior position with a prestigious marketing firm in Seattle, offering substantially higher compensation and career advancement opportunities. The timing was surprising, as I hadn't been actively seeking a change, but a former colleague now in a leadership role at the firm had recommended me for the position. As Daniel and I discussed the opportunity over dinner that evening, I found myself unusually ambivalent. The role aligned perfectly with my career trajectory and would significantly increase our financial security, potentially allowing us to complete our home renovations more quickly and accelerate our family planning timeline. However, it would require relocation to Seattle and separation from the family connections that had been strengthening in meaningful ways since the wedding fund reconciliation. "I'm torn," I admitted, pushing aside my half-eaten meal. 6 months ago, I might have seen this as an easy decision: career advancement, financial benefits, and some healthy distance from family complications. But now that we're rebuilding those relationships on more authentic terms, the calculus feels different. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "The timing is interesting. Just as your involvement with the family business is increasing and your relationships with your parents and Ethan are evolving, this opportunity would create physical distance from those connections." Exactly. And while video conferencing and weekend visits could maintain some continuity, the day-to-day interactions that have been gradually rebuilding trust would be significantly reduced. We considered the various factors: career advancement versus emerging family business opportunities, Seattle's urban energy versus our growing attachment to our Portland neighborhood, the excitement of a new professional challenge versus the deepening community connections we'd been establishing. "What feels most important to you right now?" Daniel asked, his tone suggesting genuine curiosity rather than leading me toward a particular conclusion. I considered the question carefully. If I'm completely honest, the professional advancement and financial benefits, while appealing, don't outweigh what we've been building here. Not just the house itself, but the reconstructed family relationships and the community we're creating. The Seattle job represents a continuation of the achievement-oriented values that shaped my early life. Staying here, balancing my established career with growing involvement in the family business and our home creation, feels more aligned with the values I'm choosing for myself now. Daniel smiled, reaching across the table to take my hand. "I think you just made your decision. And for what it's worth, I agree. What we're building here, physically, relationally, communally, feels worth prioritizing over conventional career advancement right now." The next morning, I called the Seattle firm to respectfully decline their offer, explaining that while I was honored by their interest, my current professional and personal commitments in Portland took precedence at this life stage. The conversation was brief but cordial, with an open door for future consideration should circumstances change. Later that day, I met my father for coffee, a regular check-in we'd established to discuss business transition matters outside the formal quarterly meetings. After updating him on several pending projects, I mentioned the job offer I'd declined. "Seattle would have been a significant opportunity," he observed, studying my expression. "May I ask what factors influenced your decision to stay in Portland?" "Many things," I acknowledged. "Our home renovation project, Daniel's established position at the university, the consulting business I've been developing, but also the evolving family relationships and my increasing involvement with Parker Electrical." My father nodded slowly. "I appreciate your transparency, and I want you to know that while I'm personally glad you're remaining in Portland, I would have supported whatever choice served your goals and well-being. The patterns we're working to change include any pressure to prioritize family business or proximity over your individual professional development. His explicit rejection of the old expectation that family needs automatically supersede individual goals represented another step in our evolving relationship. The wedding fund betrayal had exemplified the previous paradigm. My milestone subordinated to Ethan's perceived needs without consultation or consent. This new approach acknowledged my autonomy while expressing genuine appreciation for my choice to remain connected. I know you would have supported a different decision, I assured him, recognizing the importance of acknowledging his growth. That actually made the choice easier, knowing it was truly mine to make, rather than a response to implicit expectations or guilt. As we continued discussing business matters, I realized how profoundly my perspective on family connections had shifted over the past year. The wedding fund betrayal had initially seemed like an irreparable breach of trust, forcing me to establish rigid independence as self-protection. Gradually, that defensive posture had evolved into something more nuanced, maintaining healthy boundaries while allowing for genuine reconnection based on new, more equitable terms of engagement. This evolution became even more apparent the following week when Ethan called with unexpected news. Megan's been offered a nursing position in Bend, he explained, referring to the mountain town 3 hours southeast of Portland. It's a significant advancement opportunity for her, leading a new community health initiative. That sounds perfect for her skills, I said, genuinely pleased for my sister-in-law while recognizing the implications. Are you considering relocating? We're discussing it seriously, he admitted. The position is compelling, and Ben's outdoor lifestyle aligns well with our family priorities. My photography business could potentially transition to that market, focusing on outdoor and adventure imagery. But there are obvious complications with the family business transition and the kids' relationships with grandparents. Have you talked with Mom and Dad yet? I asked, curious about how they would respond to this potential change given our recent family evolution. Not yet, Ethan said, hesitation evident in his voice. I wanted to discuss it with you first, particularly regarding the business transition. Your involvement has become significant, and if we move to Bend, the co-trustee arrangement might require adjustment. His consideration of my perspective before approaching our parents represented another shift in our sibling dynamic. Previously, Ethan might have presumed parental support for whatever choice served his immediate family needs, regardless of implications for other family members. Now he was explicitly acknowledging the interconnected nature of our family system and seeking collaborative approaches to potential changes. I appreciate you raising this directly, I said. The business transition can accommodate geographic distance through virtual meetings and periodic in-person sessions. We should consider creating more formal documentation of decision-making protocols to ensure clarity when immediate consultation isn't possible, but that's manageable. That's helpful perspective, Ethan said, relief evident in his tone. Would you be willing to join us when we discuss this with Mom and Dad? Your presence might help frame it as a family evolution rather than abandonment of responsibilities. The request for support illustrated how fundamentally our relationship had changed since the wedding fund situation. Rather than competition for parental resources or attention, we were developing genuine collaboration based on recognition of our complementary strengths. Of course, I agreed. Let me know when you'd like to have that conversation, and Daniel and I will be there. The family meeting to discuss Ethan and Megan's potential relocation took place the following Sunday afternoon. My parents' initial reaction reflected their generational expectations, concern about family distance, questions about the children's education, and subtle expressions of disappointment about reduced grandparent involvement. However, the conversation quickly evolved from these reflexive responses to a more thoughtful consideration of how the family might adapt to this change. Bend isn't exactly across the country, my father acknowledged after his initial concerns had been aired and addressed. A 3-hour drive makes regular visits feasible, and technology allows for daily connection with the grandchildren. And this opportunity represents significant professional advancement for Megan, my mother added, making a visible effort to prioritize individual growth over family proximity. Just as we supported Allison's consulting business development, we want to honor your career progression too. The explicit parallel between support for my professional choices and Megan's represented another step in the family's evolving approach to resource allocation, both emotional and practical. My parents were demonstrating in real time their commitment to valuing each family member's path equally, rather than privileging certain roles or choices. As the discussion continued, we developed a collaborative framework for maintaining family connections despite geographic distance. My parents would visit Bend monthly. My father would establish regular video conferences with Ethan regarding business matters, and holiday gatherings would alternate between locations to share the travel burden equitably. We should also consider how this affects the business transition timeline, my father said, turning to me. With Ethan at a distance, your local oversight becomes more significant. Are you comfortable with that increased responsibility alongside your existing professional commitments? The question represented another evolution in our relationship, acknowledging my agency and capacity constraints, rather than assuming my availability for family needs. A year earlier, increased business responsibilities would likely have been presented as an expectation rather than a choice requiring my consent. I can adjust my consulting schedule to accommodate additional oversight for the next 6 months, I offered. After that, we should reevaluate based on how the distance arrangement is working and whether further adjustments are needed. That's a reasonable approach, my father agreed. We'll formalize these modifications to the transition plan and review them quarterly to ensure they're sustainable for everyone involved. The methodical, collaborative approach to this significant family change contrasted sharply with how the wedding fund redirection had been handled. Unilateral decision-making justified as necessary without consideration of alternative approaches, or directly affected parties' perspectives. The family was demonstrating, through concrete actions rather than mere apologies, that fundamental patterns had indeed changed. As the meeting concluded, my mother surprised everyone with an unexpected suggestion. What if we consider purchasing a small vacation property halfway between Portland and Bend? Perhaps something near Mount Hood or in the Columbia River Gorge. It could serve as a gathering place for extended weekends and provide neutral territory for family connections without either household bearing the full hosting burden. The proposal reflected thoughtful consideration of practical family needs while respecting the independence of each household, another departure from previous patterns where my parents might have simply purchased such a property unilaterally or expected holiday gatherings to continue in their home regardless of travel burden. That's worth exploring, Ethan said, exchanging a glance with Megan. A shared family space that belongs equally to all of us, rather than representing the elder generation's domain, could create new traditions while honoring existing connections. We should establish clear parameters about ownership, usage schedules, and maintenance responsibilities, I suggested, thinking practically about potential complications in shared property arrangements. Perhaps a family LLC with equal ownership stakes and transparent governance frameworks. My father nodded approvingly. Excellent consideration. We should approach this as a business arrangement with clear documentation, even while recognizing its primary purpose as family connection. That structure protects everyone's interests and prevents future misunderstandings. The conversation continued, exploring various aspects of this possibility. Financial considerations, location preferences, structural requirements for accommodating multiple families simultaneously. Throughout the discussion, I observed how each family member's perspective was solicited and valued, creating a genuinely collaborative approach to family evolution rather than adherence to hierarchical decision-making. In the weeks that followed, Ethan and Megan decided to accept the Bend opportunity, initiating preparations for relocation while maintaining open communication about transition challenges. My parents, true to their commitment to supporting individual growth alongside family connection, helped research housing options in Bend while simultaneously exploring potential shared vacation properties. The family business transition plan was formally modified to accommodate geographic distance, with transparent documentation and scheduled reviews to ensure sustainability. Throughout this period, Daniel and I continued our home renovation projects, completing the primary bathroom remodel and beginning preparations for refinishing the original hardwood floors throughout the main level. The house was gradually transforming from a promising but neglected property into a comfortable, personalized home that reflected our aesthetic and functional priorities. One evening in early April, as we sat on our newly restored front porch, enjoying the first truly warm evening of spring, Daniel broached the topic we'd been circling for several months. With the bathroom renovation complete and the business transition adjustments in place, he began, his tone carefully casual. I'm wondering if we're ready to revisit our family planning conversations more concretely. The question hung in the mild evening air, carrying significant weight despite its gentle delivery. We had discussed children theoretically since before our engagement, always with the assumption that parenthood would be part of our future. The wedding fund betrayal had temporarily disrupted those plans, raising questions about bringing children into a family system with dysfunctional patterns. The subsequent healing and restructuring of family relationships had gradually restored our confidence in creating our own family culture while maintaining healthier connections with extended family. I think we are, I said after a thoughtful pause. The work we've done personally and collectively over the past year has created a foundation I feel good about building upon. Not perfect, certainly, but thoughtfully constructed with awareness of potential pitfalls and strategies for addressing them. Daniel reached for my hand, his expression a mix of excitement and solemnity. I agree. We've established our home, strengthened our partnership through challenging circumstances, and developed clearer boundaries with extended family. Those elements create a stable foundation for introducing children into our lives. As we continued, discussing logistical considerations, timing relative to work commitments, financial preparations, practical home adaptations, I felt a sense of readiness that had been absent during our previous conversations about parenthood. The wedding fund betrayal, painful as it had been, had ultimately forced necessary growth and clarification about family values, boundaries, and relationship patterns that might otherwise have remained unexamined until directly challenged by parenting experiences. 2 weeks later, we shared our decision to begin actively trying to conceive with my parents during a Sunday dinner at their home. Their reaction reflected the continued evolution in our relationship, genuine excitement, without immediately overwhelming us with unsolicited advice or presumptuous expectations. "This is wonderful news," my mother said, her smile warm but restrained. "We're here to support you however would be most helpful, but we also respect that you and Daniel will make your own parenting decisions." "Exactly," my father agreed. Our generation often imposed expectations about how families should function without recognizing diverse approaches to raising children. We're learning to celebrate the paths our children choose rather than expecting conformity to our preferences. Their self-awareness regarding potential intergenerational tensions represented another step in our family's transformation. Rather than repeating patterns of conditional support and unilateral expectations, they were explicitly acknowledging our autonomy while offering flexible assistance based on our defined needs rather than their assumptions. Later that evening, as Daniel and I prepared for bed, he observed, "Your parents' response to our family planning decision was remarkably different from how they might have reacted a year ago." It really was, I agreed, reflecting on the interaction. Before the wedding fund situation forced everything into the open, they likely would have immediately begun making plans and establishing expectations without consulting us. Which nursery, furniture we needed, how often they should babysit, whether I would reduce my work hours. Instead, they offered support while explicitly recognizing our decision-making authority. "The irony isn't lost on me," Daniel said as he turned out the bedside lamp. "The painful breach of trust that nearly severed your relationship with them ultimately created space for a healthier dynamic that will benefit our children in tangible ways." His observation captured the complex journey our family had traversed since that Sunday afternoon when I learned my wedding fund had been redirected to Ethan's house. What had initially felt like irreparable betrayal had gradually transformed into a catalyst for necessary change. Painful, but ultimately productive in breaking dysfunctional patterns that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. In early May, Ethan and Megan completed their relocation to Bend, settling into a craftsman bungalow similar to our Portland home, but with mountain views and proximity to outdoor recreation opportunities. The parallels between our housing choices, both prioritizing character, community, and renovation potential over size or luxury, highlighted another evolving aspect of our relationship. Rather than maintaining the competitive dynamic our parents had inadvertently fostered, we were discovering genuine commonalities in our values and preferences, despite our different life paths. 2 weeks after their move, my parents invited Daniel and me to view a property they were considering for the family gathering place, a modest cabin near Mount Hood with sufficient sleeping space for both families, a large central gathering area, and outdoor amenities that would serve all seasons. The property required significant updating, but offered solid structural bones and spectacular natural surroundings. "We wanted your perspective before proceeding further," my father explained, as we toured the space. "This would be a shared family resource, so everyone's input matters in the selection process." "Ethan and Megan viewed it yesterday," my mother added. "They liked the location and overall layout, but had concerns about the kitchen configuration for accommodating multiple cooks simultaneously." "That's a valid consideration," I agreed. "Assessing the galley kitchen that would indeed become congested with more than 2 people working together. Perhaps opening this wall to create a more communal cooking space would address that concern while maintaining the cabin's structural integrity." As we continued exploring the property, suggesting potential modifications and discussing usage patterns, I reflected on how fundamentally the family decision-making process had changed since the wedding fund situation. My parents were genuinely incorporating everyone's perspectives rather than presenting decisions as fait accompli. They were considering practical needs alongside emotional factors, and they were establishing transparent structures for shared resources rather than maintaining unilateral control. "What are your thoughts about governance for this shared space?" I asked as we settled on the cabin's deck overlooking a small stream that cut through the property. "How would decisions about maintenance, improvements, and scheduling be made?" "We've been considering an LLC structure similar to what you suggested," my father replied. "Equal ownership shares for both family units, with clear documentation regarding usage priorities, financial responsibilities, and decision-making protocols. Perhaps quarterly meetings to address any concerns or proposed changes, with unanimous consent required for significant modifications." The approach represented another departure from previous family patterns, creating formal structures that ensured equitable treatment rather than relying on unspoken expectations that typically privileged certain perspectives over others. By Mawar. Establishing transparent governance frameworks. My parents were demonstrating commitment to sustainable change rather than temporary behavioral modifications designed to appease hurt feelings. After thoroughly exploring the property and discussing both its potential and limitations, we agreed it offered a promising foundation for the shared family space concept. My parents would proceed with a formal inspection and assessment of renovation requirements before making a final decision in consultation with both households. As Daniel and I drove back to Portland that afternoon, winding through the forested highways from Mount Hood to the city. I found myself reflecting on the journey our family had traversed since the wedding fund revelation. "It's remarkable," I observed, "how a painful betrayal ultimately created the catalyst for addressing dysfunctional patterns that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. Without that forcing event, would my parents ever have recognized how their different treatment of Ethan and me was damaging our family connections?" "Probably not," Daniel acknowledged. "Comfortable systems rarely change voluntarily, even when they're causing harm. Sometimes it takes a significant breach to create space for genuine examination and reconstruction." "Which doesn't justify the initial betrayal," I clarified, still protective of the legitimacy of my hurt response to the wedding fund redirection. "Of course not," Daniel agreed immediately. "They were wrong to repurpose your trust fund for Ethan's house, particularly without consultation or transparency. But the aftermath, the painful reckoning and subsequent rebuilding, has created something arguably healthier than what existed before." His assessment aligned with my own complex feelings about our family's evolution. The wedding fund betrayal had shattered my assumptions about my place in the family hierarchy and forced me to establish independence from parental validation or support. That painful separation had ultimately created space for reconnection on more authentic terms, not because I needed their approval or resources, but because I valued relationship within appropriate boundaries. "I wonder how different our family dynamic might be when our children arrive," I mused as we approached the outskirts of Portland. "The patterns we're establishing now, transparent communication, equitable resource allocation, respect for individual autonomy alongside family connection, create a foundation for healthier intergenerational relationships than what I experienced growing up." "That's the hope, isn't it?" Daniel replied. "That we learn from previous patterns, intentionally disrupting harmful cycles while preserving valuable traditions and connections. Not perfect, certainly, but more conscious and deliberately constructed." His framing captured what we were collectively attempting, not erasing the past or pretending the wedding fund betrayal hadn't occurred, but using that painful experience as a catalyst for creating more thoughtful family structures moving forward. The broken promise had revealed fault lines in the family system that might otherwise have remained hidden until triggered by future conflicts, potentially causing even greater damage if left unaddressed. In early June, my monthly cycle failed to arrive as expected. After a week of increasing anticipation, I purchased a home pregnancy test, waiting until a Saturday morning when Daniel and I could process the results together regardless of outcome. The positive indicator appeared almost immediately. 2 clear lines confirming what my body had already begun suggesting through subtle changes in energy, appetite, and sensitivity. We sat together on the edge of the bathtub, holding hands in silence as the implications settled around us. This wasn't unexpected. We had been intentionally trying to conceive for several months, but the reality of impending parenthood still arrived with profound emotional impact. "We're going to be parents," Daniel said finally, his voice holding wonder and a touch of apprehension. "Everything we've been working toward, creating our home, strengthening our marriage, rebuilding family connections on healthier terms, now has this additional purpose and meaning." "It feels like the completion of a circle in some ways," I reflected. "A year ago, we were grappling with the betrayal of our wedding fund and questioning my place in the family structure. Now we're preparing to expand that family with our own child, bringing new perspective to those relationships while establishing our own parenting approach." We spent the weekend absorbing this news privately, discussing practical considerations alongside emotional responses. We agreed to wait until the first prenatal appointment confirmed viability before sharing with family, recognizing the delicate balance between excitement and caution during early pregnancy. 2 weeks later, with medical confirmation and the first ultrasound image safely secured in an envelope, we invited my parents to dinner at our home. The evening represented another milestone in our evolving relationship, hosting them in our space, preparing food in the kitchen we had renovated, with the trust restitution funds, creating new traditions that honored connection while maintaining appropriate boundaries. After dinner, as we settled in the living room with coffee and the berry crumble Daniel had prepared, I reached for the envelope containing the ultrasound image. "We have something to share with you," I said, meeting my mother's eyes as understanding, dawned immediately in her expression. Mothers seem to have a particular intuition for such announcements, recognizing the subtle shifts in behavior and energy that precede them. I handed the envelope to my father, allowing him the experience of discovery. As he opened it and registered the grainy image with its identifying labels, his composure briefly faltered. This man who had built a successful business through strategic planning and careful control of his emotional responses was momentarily overcome. His eyes filling with tears he made no attempt to conceal. "You're going to have a baby," he said, his voice catching slightly as he passed the image to my mother. "We're going to be grandparents again." My mother's reaction combined joy with a restraint that reflected our new family dynamic. Genuine excitement without presumptuous expectations or immediate insertion into decision-making. "This is wonderful news," she said, studying the ultrasound carefully before looking up at me with tears in her eyes. "How are you feeling, both physically and emotionally?" Her question prioritized my experience rather than immediately focusing on her role or expectations. Another shift from previous patterns where family news might have been immediately repositioned within the context of parental preferences or plans. "I'm feeling good overall," I replied honestly. "Some fatigue and occasional queasiness, but nothing severe. Emotionally, it's a mix of excitement, occasional anxiety about the unknown, and a deepening appreciation for how our family has evolved over the past year." "The timing feels significant," Daniel added, his hand finding mine in quiet support. "We're creating new life, just as we've been creating new patterns of relationship and communication within the extended family. There's a sense of alignment that feels meaningful." My father nodded thoughtfully. "I've been reflecting recently on family patterns, how certain dynamics get established and perpetuated without conscious intention, sometimes for generations. The wedding fund situation, painful as it was, forced us to recognize patterns we might never have identified otherwise, and hopefully disrupt them before they affected the next generation," my mother added with unusual candor. "The different treatment of you and Ethan, the unspoken expectations based on gender or personality rather than individual paths, those patterns would likely have continued into relationships with grandchildren if we hadn't been forced to confront them directly. Their self-awareness represented genuine growth rather than merely modified behavior designed to appease hurt feelings. They were acknowledging the wedding fund betrayal not as an isolated incident of poor judgment, but as a symptom of deeper family patterns that required conscious examination and restructuring. "We want you to know," my father continued, "that we're committed to supporting your parenting journey. However would be most helpful to you, without imposing our expectations or preferences. We recognize that you and Daniel will make your own decisions about raising your child, and we respect that autonomy. We're here as a resource when needed," my mother added, "but with full recognition that you're the parents and decision makers. We've learned, belatedly but sincerely, that support means honoring your choices rather than expecting conformity to our vision." Their explicit acknowledgement of my parental authority and autonomy represented another evolution in our relationship. Throughout my childhood and early adulthood, my parents had positioned themselves as the ultimate arbiters of family values and expectations, with children expected to conform regardless of individual preferences or perspectives. This new approach recognized the transition to a multi-generational family system with shared authority and mutual respect, rather than hierarchical control. As the evening progressed, our conversation touched on practical considerations, timeline for sharing the news with Ethan and Megan, potential adaptations to the shared cabin property to accommodate an infant, scheduling considerations for family, gatherings given my due date in early February. Throughout these discussions, my parents maintained a careful balance between engagement and restraint, offering perspectives when relevant while explicitly acknowledging our decision-making authority. When they prepared to leave, my father hesitated at the door, seeming to consider his words carefully before speaking. "I want you to know," he said finally, "that watching you create your family on your own terms, establishing your home, building your marriage, and now preparing for parenthood, has given me a perspective I wish I'd had earlier in life." "What perspective is that?" I asked, genuinely curious about this moment of vulnerability from a man who had traditionally maintained careful emotional control. "That the greatest legacy isn't financial resources or business success," he replied thoughtfully, "but the relationships we build and the patterns we establish." For many years, I measured my value as a parent by my ability to provide material security and educational opportunities. I'm learning, rather late, that emotional security and genuine acceptance might have been more valuable gifts. His insight represented not just personal growth, but recognition of how the wedding fund betrayal had revealed fundamental misalignments in family values. By prioritizing Ethan's material need over a commitment made to me, my parents had demonstrated a hierarchy of values that positioned practical considerations above relationship integrity. Their subsequent actions, not just financial restitution but structural changes in family decision-making and resource allocation, suggested genuine reconsideration of those priorities. After my parents departed, Daniel and I settled on the porch swing, enjoying the fragrant spring evening as darkness gradually enveloped our neighborhood. The porch had become one of our favorite spaces, connecting our private home environment with the community around us, a physical manifestation of the balance we sought between independence and connection. "Your parents' response to our news was remarkably different from what it might have been a year ago," Daniel observed, his arm comfortably around my shoulders. "It really was," I agreed. Before the wedding fund situation forced everything into the open, they likely would have immediately begun making plans and establishing expectations without consulting us. Instead, they offered support while explicitly recognizing our decision-making authority. "The irony isn't lost on me," Daniel mused. "The painful breach of trust that nearly severed your relationship with them ultimately created space for a healthier dynamic that will benefit our child in tangible ways." His observation captured the complex journey our family had traversed since that Sunday afternoon, when I learned my wedding fund had been redirected to Ethan's house. What had initially felt like irreparable betrayal had gradually transformed into a catalyst for necessary change, painful but ultimately productive in breaking dysfunctional patterns that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. As my pregnancy progressed through summer and into early fall, the evolving family dynamics continued to manifest in various contexts. My parents maintained their commitment to supporting without controlling, offering practical assistance when requested while respecting our autonomy regarding nursery preparation, childcare planning, and parenting philosophy development. Ethan and Megan, now settled in their Bend community, engaged enthusiastically via video calls and occasional visits, sharing experiences from their own parenting journey without positioning them as directives or expectations. The shared cabin property near Mount Hood was purchased and renovated through truly collaborative effort, with each family contributing according to capacity and expertise rather than predetermined expectations. My father's business acumen guided the financial structuring. Ethan's design sense informed the aesthetic updates, Daniel's practical skills addressed minor repairs, and my organizational abilities created the governance framework for shared usage and maintenance. My mother and Megan collaborated on furnishing and outfitting the space for multi-generational comfort, ensuring it could accommodate both active children and adults seeking relaxation. Throughout this process, I observed how the painful catalyst of the wedding fund betrayal had ultimately facilitated necessary growth in our family system. Without that forcing event, Would my parents have recognized how their different treatment of Ethan and me was damaging our family connections? Would they have established transparent processes for shared resources rather than maintaining unilateral control? Would they have learned to respect individual autonomy while nurturing family cohesion? The answers to these questions remained speculative, but the tangible changes in family functioning were undeniable. The wedding fund betrayal, while personally painful, had ultimately benefited the extended family system by forcing examination of dysfunctional patterns before they affected the next generation. The broken promise had revealed fault lines in the family structure that might otherwise have remained hidden until triggered by future conflicts, potentially causing even greater damage. As autumn painted the Portland landscape in vibrant oranges and deep reds, Daniel and I completed the nursery preparation in what had previously been our home office. The small room overlooking the backyard garden had been transformed with gentle colors, practical furnishings, and carefully selected items that would support our child's development without overwhelming their senses. Unlike the elaborate themed nurseries featured in design magazines, our approach prioritized simplicity, flexibility, and natural elements, a physical manifestation of our developing parenting philosophy. One crisp October afternoon, as we arranged books on the nursery shelves and discussed potential rearrangements of our remaining office equipment in the guest room, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this point. "It's strange to think," I said, placing a collection of classic children's literature on a low shelf, "that if my parents hadn't redirected the wedding fund to Ethan's house, we might never have addressed the patterns that could have damaged our child's relationship with them." Daniel paused in his assembly of a rocking chair, considering this observation. "That's the paradox, isn't it? The betrayal that initially made you question bringing children into this family system ultimately catalyzed changes that created a healthier environment for them." "Which doesn't justify the original betrayal," I clarified, still protective of the legitimacy of my hurt response to the wedding fund redirection. "Of course not," Daniel agreed immediately. "They were wrong to repurpose your trust fund without consultation or transparency. But the aftermath, the painful reckoning and subsequent rebuilding, has created something arguably healthier than what existed before." His assessment aligned with my own complex feelings about our family's evolution. The wedding fund betrayal had shattered my assumptions about my place in the family hierarchy and forced me to establish independence from parental validation or support. That painful separation had ultimately created space for reconnection on more authentic terms, not because I needed their approval or resources, but because I valued relationship within appropriate boundaries. "I wonder how our child's experience of family will differ from mine," I mused, resting a hand on my gradually expanding midsection. The patterns we're establishing now: transparent communication, equitable resource allocation, respect for individual autonomy alongside family connection, create a foundation for healthier intergenerational relationships than what I experienced growing up. "That's the hope, isn't it?" Daniel replied, tightening the final screw on the rocking chair before testing its motion. "That we learn from previous patterns, intentionally disrupting harmful cycles while preserving valuable traditions and connections. Not perfect, certainly, but more conscious and deliberately constructed." As winter approached and my pregnancy entered its final months, the family gathered for Thanksgiving at the newly renovated shared cabin. The space functioned exactly as intended, providing neutral territory where both households could connect without either bearing the full hosting burden. The thoughtfully designed great room accommodated comfortable conversation. The expanded kitchen supported collaborative meal preparation, and the surrounding natural beauty offered opportunities for walks and outdoor activities between meals. Throughout the weekend, I observed the continuing evolution in family dynamics. My father engaged Ethan in genuine conversation about his photography business without subtle messaging about real work or financial stability. My mother sought Daniel's perspective on educational approaches without positioning her experience as automatically authoritative. Ethan and I exchanged parenting insights without the competitive undercurrent that might previously have characterized such interactions. Most significantly, every family member demonstrated awareness of potential, patterns without prompting or confrontation. When my father began to offer unsolicited financial advice regarding college savings for our unborn child, he caught himself mid-sentence, paused, and restructured his approach. "I have some thoughts about education funding if you're interested in discussing them, but I completely respect that you and Daniel will make these decisions based on your own values and priorities." This self-correction, offered without defensive justification or expectation of appreciation, represented genuine integration of new awareness rather than performative behavior change. He was recognizing potential boundary crossings before completing them, adjusting his approach based on respect for our autonomy rather than reacting to express discomfort or confrontation. Similarly, when discussion turned to potential names for our child, my mother demonstrated remarkable restraint compared to her previous tendency to assert preferences as pseudo-requirements. "Have you settled on any possibilities you're comfortable sharing?" she asked, the phrasing carefully constructed to acknowledge our decision-making authority while expressing appropriate interest. "We're considering several options," I replied, appreciating her respectful approach. "We'd like to meet our little one before making a final decision, but we're drawn to names with family significance balanced with contemporary usability." "That's a thoughtful approach," she acknowledged. "Names are so personal. They should resonate with the parent's values and vision while serving the child well throughout life." The conversation continued with family members offering occasional suggestions framed explicitly as options rather than expectations, each contribution prefaced with acknowledgement of our ultimate decision-making authority. This collaborative, rather than directive approach represented another evolution in family functioning, recognition of shared interest without presumption of control. As the weekend drew to a close and we prepared to return to our respective homes, my father gathered everyone in the great room for a brief but significant moment. "Before we disperse," he began, his manner more reflective than directive, "I want to express gratitude for this gathering and what it represents. 2 years ago, our family experienced a painful breach that could have permanently damaged our connections. The wedding fund situation revealed patterns none of us were fully conscious of, but that were causing real harm to our relationships." His direct reference to the betrayal without minimization or justification demonstrated continued integration of the lessons learned rather than expectation that past hurts should remain unacknowledged once apologies had been offered. "The work all of you have done, both individually and collectively, to address those patterns and build healthier connections inspires me," he continued. "This cabin, with its shared ownership and transparent governance, represents the new approach we're creating together. One based on mutual respect, equitable consideration, and genuine collaboration rather than hierarchical control." As he spoke, I reflected on the journey from that Sunday afternoon when I discovered my wedding fund had been redirected to Ethan's house to this moment of genuine family connection. The pain of that betrayal had been real and significant, requiring substantial healing and reconstruction rather than simple forgiveness and continuation. Yet the catalyst it had provided for examining and addressing dysfunctional family patterns had ultimately created opportunities for more authentic relationships than might otherwise have developed. My father concluded his remarks with an observation that captured this paradoxical outcome. "Sometimes," he said thoughtfully, "our most painful experiences become doorways to necessary growth. The wedding fund situation forced us to confront patterns we might never have recognized otherwise, creating an opportunity to build something stronger and more authentic than what existed before." As I listened, one hand resting on my expanded abdomen where our child periodically signaled their presence through gentle movements, I felt a sense of completion, despite knowing our family journey would continue evolving for decades to come. The broken promise that had initially seemed like irreparable betrayal had ultimately facilitated necessary transformation in our family system. Not because the betrayal itself was justified or acceptable, but because our collective response to that painful catalyst had prioritized genuine healing over superficial reconciliation. Daniel's hand found mine, offering silent support as it had throughout this complex journey. Together, we had navigated the initial betrayal, the subsequent independence it forced us to establish, and the gradual reconstruction of family relationships on more authentic terms. Now we prepared to welcome our child into a family system still imperfect, but consciously evolving, one that had confronted dysfunctional patterns and committed to creating healthier alternatives for the next generation. As we drove back to Portland that Sunday afternoon, winding through mountain roads gradually transitioning to urban landscapes, I reflected on what I would eventually tell our child about this chapter in our family history. Not immediately, certainly. Such complex dynamics would require maturity to process appropriately. But eventually, when understanding family patterns became relevant to their own development and relationships, I would explain how promises should be honored, but how broken ones can sometimes reveal truths that might otherwise remain hidden. I would describe how family relationships require both connection and appropriate boundaries, neither enmeshment nor disconnection serving healthy development. I would acknowledge that healing from betrayal doesn't erase the original harm, but can create opportunities for growth that might not have emerged from comfortable patterns. Most importantly, I would share how their existence represented not just biological continuation, but the creation of new possibilities, the opportunity to carry forward healthier patterns while leaving dysfunctional ones behind. Their impending arrival had already influenced our family system by encouraging conscious examination of intergenerational dynamics before they could affect the next generation. As we arrived home and settled into our quiet house, preparing for the significant changes the coming months would bring, I felt a sense of readiness that transcended practical preparations. The wedding fund betrayal, painful as it had been, had ultimately strengthened rather than diminished our capacity for family connection. By forcing necessary separation from unhealthy patterns, it had created space for more authentic engagement, based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical expectations. Daniel built a fire in our newly efficient fireplace while I prepared tea, the domestic rhythm we had established in this home serving as foundation for the family culture we were creating. Outside, early winter darkness enveloped our neighborhood, while inside, warm light illuminated the space we had carefully constructed, both physically and relationally, to nurture our expanding family. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel asked as we settled on the sofa, the firelight casting gentle shadows across the living room we had gradually transformed from a neglected space to the heart of our home. "About journeys," I replied, leaning into his embrace. "How they rarely follow the paths we expect, but often lead exactly where we need to go. 2 years ago, discovering my parents had redirected my wedding fund to Ethan's house felt like devastating betrayal. Now, I can see how that painful catalyst ultimately created something stronger than what existed before. Not because the betrayal was justified," Daniel clarified, understanding the nuance in my reflection. "Definitely not," I agreed, "but because it forced necessary growth that comfortable patterns might never have triggered. Our child will be born into a family system still imperfect but consciously evolving, one that has confronted dysfunctional patterns and committed to creating healthier alternatives moving forward." As we sat together in the home we had created through our own efforts, anticipating the family we would soon begin, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this point, not despite its painful chapters, but including them as necessary elements in a larger narrative of growth and transformation. The wedding fund betrayal had ultimately revealed itself as a doorway, rather than an ending. Painful to walk through, but opening into territory we might never have. discovered otherwise. Our child would inherit not the broken patterns that had characterized previous generations, but the hard-won wisdom that comes from confronting dysfunction and consciously creating healthier alternatives. In that realization lay the most valuable inheritance of all, not financial resources or material security, but the courage to examine family patterns honestly and the commitment to evolving them thoughtfully for generations to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.